That morning the air was cold, as if the entire sky was mourning with me. There was no rain, no wind, just a sharp chill that seeped through every layer of wool and into my bones, reminding me with quiet finality. He was gone. Harold passed on an ordinary afternoon, just as quietly as he had lived. No last words, no complaints, just a gentle squeeze of my hand, a soft sigh. And then, my world went silent. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. We had been together for 43 years, 7 months, and 12 days. Others might not keep track, but I did not by calendar, but by memory. By every argument healed with a single glance. By the smell of his too strong morning coffee. By the days he spent struggling to fix the porch roof so I could sit and read without the sun hitting my eyes. And now, his funeral unfolded like a well-rehearsed play. White flowers covering the altar, the pastor delivering a warm, solemn eulogy, pews filled with old friends, neighbors, and a few colleagues from the law firm where Harold had once been a partner. But something not written into that script was the icy feeling that crept down my spine the moment Daniel walked into the church. Our only son. The boy who once called Harold his oldest best friend, who used to run through the yard with the toy truck Harold bought with his first paycheck. Daniel arrived late, and he didn't look at me when he took a seat in the second row, right by the aisle. I waited for that moment for him to come forward, place a hand on my shoulder, and say, "Mom, we'll get through this together." But his eyes only flicked over the casket, as detached as someone attending a board meeting. He wore a sharp black suit, a perfect tie, not a trace of puffiness in his face, no glimmer of moisture in his eyes. No tears, no grief. I sat in the front pew, feeling like a supporting character in the story of my own life. My husband had died, but to Daniel, what had been lost wasn't a father, it was an inheritance. When the pastor closed the eulogy with, "We don't say goodbye, we say see you again," something inside me broke. Not because of the words, but because of how Daniel stood the moment the speech ended. He shook hands with a few people, then made a brisk exit toward the car. No embrace for his mother, no words of condolence, not even one last glance at his father's photograph. I stood there, beside Harold's framed portrait, and whispered, "Do you see this, Harold? The boy we raised is no longer a boy. He's a man now, but one who never learned how to be a son." After the funeral home had been tidied and the guests slowly filtered out, I remained in the last row, alone. White petals had fallen across the cold stone floor. I looked at the empty seat Daniel had left behind, a chair still cold, never truly warmed, just like his role in this family. A young funeral assistant approached me hesitantly. "Would you like us to call a car for you, ma'am?" I shook my head gently. "No need. I still remember the way home." That afternoon, I returned to the quiet house. Wind slipped through the window where Harold once promised he'd fix the broken latch. I sat in the chair by the window, still holding our old wedding photo, his face beaming, mine so young, full of hope. "I used to be part of his life," I whispered to no one. "I was the reason he got up early, the reason he endured those final painful days. But today, no one asked if I was okay." Daniel never called after the funeral, not a message, not a question. I knew he was busy with work, with his young wife Trina, with the investment projects around the lake where Harold and I had saved for every inch of land. Some might say, perhaps his sorrow runs so deep he just doesn't know how to show it. But a mother knows. I had seen grief before its heaviness, its confusion, its quiet tremble in the voice. What I saw in Daniel wasn't any of that. There was no sorrow in his silence, only strategy, only numbers quietly ticking behind his eyes. He wasn't mourning his father. He was measuring what came next. That first night sleeping alone, I listened to the wind howling through the broken eaves Harold never got the chance to fix. I didn't cry. My tears had dried up after too many nights, hoping my son would come back as the man I raised him to be. But inside, there was a chill, a hollow place in my heart, like the living room without its light. Harold, if you're watching from wherever the quiet parts of the world carry your soul, I hope you understand. It's not the inheritance I grieve, not the title, not the empty comfort of being a widow with wealth. What aches, what truly lingers, is knowing that our son has misplaced the very thing we tried so hard to teach him, how to love. But this isn't where the story ends, because you left me something behind, something Daniel has no idea exists. 3 days after the funeral, I received a phone call from Herald's attorney's office. The voice on the line belonged to a young woman, polite, careful, with that measured warmth people use when they don't know how much grief you're holding. Mrs. Margaret Finch, Mr. Whitaker would like to invite you to the official reading of the will this Thursday at 10 a.m. Your son, Mr. Daniel Finch, will also be present. I simply said, I'll be there. No questions, no speculation. After 40-some years married to a lawyer, I'd learned this much. The most important things are rarely written on the surface. That Thursday morning, I put on the gray wool dress Herald used to like, not for anyone else, not for appearances, just in case he was still watching, somewhere. The old law office on the corner of Magnolia Street still smelled faintly of oak and ink, just as it had when Herald used to work there. Daniel was already seated when I arrived. Navy suit, phone in hand, expression unreadable. There wasn't a crease on his face. He looked more like he was heading into a business negotiation than the reading of his father's final words. Mr. Whitaker, with his snowy hair and spectacles sliding halfway down his nose, opened a worn leather case. Every motion was deliberate, as if the weight of time lived in his fingertips. Before he spoke, he looked at me and nodded just once. I can't say why, but that nod felt like someone placing a warm hand on yours in the cold. The will was drafted 2.5 years ago and is legally validated, he began. Mr. Harold Alexander Finch leaves his estate to 2 individuals, Mrs. Margaret Finch, legal spouse, and Mr. Daniel Finch, biological son. Daniel leaned in slightly. To Mrs. Margaret Finch, he bequeaths the entire Waverly Lake house, including its contents, personal belongings, the book collection, and all items attached to the spiritual legacy of Mr. Harold Finch. I wasn't surprised. That house was never just his, it was ours. As for the financial assets, the retirement fund of $420,000 will be divided into 3 parts, 30% to Daniel, 30% to Margaret, and the remaining 40% to the local charitable trust, per Mr. Harold's wishes. I glanced at Daniel. His jaw twitched barely. I imagine he had expected more. He didn't speak, but I felt the tension ripple under his stillness. Just then, Mr. Whitaker added, almost gently, "There is also a final envelope. It is addressed privately to Mrs. Margaret Finch and is not to be read aloud." I froze. Daniel turned to look at me, but I didn't return his gaze. Mr. Whitaker handed me a cream envelope sealed with red wax, old-fashioned, just like Harold always preferred. I didn't open it there. I left the office and walked a full circle around the lake. The morning was crisp, the water unmoving. Somewhere across the shore, a duck called out. Small sounds in a large world, but they brought me a strange stillness, as if the silence itself were listening. When I returned home, I made a pot of black tea and placed the envelope on the old wooden table by the window. My fingers touched the edge of the wax. They trembled not out of fear, but because I knew Harold never did anything without reason. I broke the seal slowly, like opening a door to the past. Inside was a single sheet of paper. His handwriting remained firm, only slightly slanted, as though he were still at his desk, sipping coffee and speaking to me in that quiet way he always did. To my Liz, if you're reading this, I'm no longer beside you, but I need you to know, I never left without leaving something behind for you, something that is yours and yours alone. There's an account one I've built quietly over the last 18 years through private investments and off-record earnings. I kept it separate from the will to save you from legal headaches. It's a joint account, yours and mine, only to activate upon the passing of one. Now, it's entirely yours. The amount is $19 million. It's been transferred into a private trust account under the name Margaret Finch Legacy Trust. Contact details, account numbers, verification codes, they're all enclosed in the small blue envelope. You don't owe anyone an explanation. You don't have to share it. You may use it to live peacefully, to do what you believe in, or simply to hold it like a quiet piece of us untouched. I only ask one thing. Don't ever let anyone make you feel you need permission to keep what has always belonged to you. Loving you then, now, always, Herald. I let the letter slip from my fingers. It floated down gently, coming to rest on the edge of the table, as if even the air around it understood it carried something sacred. The afternoon light streamed through the sheer curtains, soft and golden, casting delicate shadows that stretched across the worn rug beneath my feet. I turned toward the window, his window, the one where he used to sit, book in hand, glasses perched halfway down his nose, always pretending not to watch me moving about the kitchen. I whispered, not to the room, but to the memory still living there. You always knew what I needed even when I didn't say it. And then I smiled, not out of joy, not entirely out of sorrow either. It was the kind of smile that rises when love lingers in the silence. The kind that knows gratitude and ache can live in the same breath. I reached for the blue envelope, opened it slowly, as though I were unfolding the final page of a story only he and I had written together. Inside were documents stamped, sealed, indisputable, a transfer from an international bank, quiet proof of a promise kept, beneficiary, Margaret Finch, usage, unrestricted, legal standing, sole, personal asset, exempt from probate, not subject to division. I traced each line with my eyes, letting it settle not just into my mind, but deeper, into the places where doubts once lived. Then I folded the papers, careful not to crease what he had protected. In my thoughts, I saw Daniel again, how he leaned forward when the numbers were read, how a flicker crossed his face, not of grief, but of calculation paused. He'll come back, I know this. He'll ask in that careful voice of his, "Mom, was there something else?" And when that moment comes, I will look him in the eye, not to punish, not to withhold, but to measure gently, quietly, whether he is still the boy I once carried, or the man who believes love is something owed. $19 million. But this was never about the money. It was a note slipped between the lines. A key left in the lock. A door. Herald opened, just enough for me to remember. I have always been here. I have always mattered, even when they tried to write me out of the story. And sometimes, the most valuable thing a person can give isn't gold or land or praise, but the unshakable truth that you were never invisible to them. Do you believe that too? That real love leaves its mark, not in noise, but in quiet knowing. If you do, tell me. I'm listening. I used to think that if anything could soften a mother's ache, it would be time. But after all these years, I've come to understand that some emptiness in the heart isn't meant to fade. It stays exactly where it is, not to torment us, but to remind us, with a dull and sudden throb, of something that was once beautiful and is now gone. Daniel is my only child, and for a long time, he was the reason I folded my life into the shape of hope. I thought if I loved him enough, for long enough, that love would circle back as surely as water fills a glass when you keep pouring. But I was wrong. Some children don't grow up to be kind. They grow up to become better at hiding the hollow parts of themselves and calling it adulthood. Daniel used to be a boy who said thank you, or at least, I believed he was. I remember the day he came home from third grade after being chosen to give a speech at the end-of-year assembly. He ran into my arms, held me tight, and whispered, "I said that because you read to me every night." I cried not for the speech, but because, in that moment, I felt seen. I felt necessary. But somewhere along the way, that look, the one that once recognized me as someone who mattered, dimmed. It faded beneath layers of distraction and eventually disappeared into indifference. The change began in college, then deepened when he moved away for work. Money came early and too easily, and when it did, Daniel began to believe that the people who raised him were just placeholders from a past he no longer needed. One bad investment left him drowning in debt. He spiraled into addiction. He abandoned his young family. But Herald, my husband, never turned his back. He sold the small plot of land behind our house, paid off nearly $300,000 of Daniel's debts, checked him into rehab, and shielded him from every whisper of gossip. We told the family Daniel was away getting a master's degree on the East Coast, just to protect his pride. And Daniel? He never once said thank you. I remember the night Herald handed him the admittance form for the treatment center. There were no raised voices, no anger, no blame, just one sentence, quiet, but heavy enough to break a father's heart. I don't need you to be grateful. I just need you to stay alive. But even that, Daniel couldn't hold on to. 3 years later, he vanished again, this time to Florida, leaving behind his second wife and a child too young to say the word, Daddy. When Herald heard the news, he didn't cry. He just walked out into the garden in the middle of the night and lit a cigarette, the first he'd touched in 25 years. I followed him, saying nothing, and placed my hand on his back. He didn't turn to me. He only said, almost to himself, I did everything I could, Liz. But he's never known how to be thankful. And then, as if summoned not by love but by calculation, Daniel returned, not because he missed us, not because he'd changed. He came back because Herald was ill, and Daniel sensed that time was slipping through his fingers. He brought no flowers, no apologies, just a laptop and a stack of legal documents full of sterile language. Sitting at the same kitchen table where he once drew rocket ships with crayons, he laid out estate transfer forms, outlined how to draft a new will, and explained in flat, clinical terms the tax benefits of early action. When Herald began coughing uncontrollably and I helped him lie down, Daniel didn't even look up. His eyes never left the screen. Does Dad want to sign now? He asked. I can take care of the paperwork quickly. And when I asked gently, is there anything you'd like to say to your father? He shrugged. Not really. You always make things more dramatic than they need to be. That night, after he left, I sat beside Herald and cleaned his glasses, just as I'd done for decades. Then I opened the small drawer in his writing desk, the one where he kept his folded notes and reminders. I found a slip of paper, no longer than my palm, written in the narrow, unwavering hand I knew by heart. Don't believe what people say when they need something from you, it read. Watch how they treat you when you have nothing left to give. At the bottom, just one word, Daniel. I folded the paper and tucked it into the Bible beside my bed. I didn't cry, I wasn't angry, I didn't curse him. There was only a silence inside me, long and hollow, like I had finally allowed myself to accept something I had resisted for too long. That my son no longer saw me as a mother. He didn't know gratitude, and perhaps he never intended to ask for forgiveness. But I still had one thing left, something he knew nothing about and would never expect. A private letter left behind by Herald, not listed in any official record, not part of the will, just for me. Inside was his final message and a certificate for a private fund worth $19 million. Untouchable, undivided, mine alone. And in his words, I found the most important truth. Use it as you wish, don't give to anyone if you don't want to. Let them receive only what they deserve. I folded that paper carefully and placed it in the drawer with Herald's old pocket watch. We had once raised a child with every ounce of love we had, but sometimes love is not enough to make someone stay. And as for me, I have nothing left to hold on to anymore except one thing, the quiet certainty that I did what was right, and the one thing he will never be able to take from me, my dignity and my choice. That afternoon, the air had a certain bite to it. Not the kind that came from wind or rain, but the kind that crept quietly into the hollow of your chest as the end of the year approached and everything familiar took on the silence of something fading. I was sitting by the window in my old armchair, its back curved just right from decades of use, watching the light blur behind the fogged glass when the phone rang. It was Daniel. I couldn't remember the last time my son had called me out of his own accord. His voice came through low and unusually gentle, laced with the kind of softness you'd expect from someone who'd finally learned how to care. He invited me to dinner, said it was to make up for lost time between us, in his words. I hesitated, wondering for a moment if I'd heard wrong. But then I said yes, partly out of curiosity, partly out of something more fragile and foolish hope, the kind that mothers carry, even when we know better. The car arrived at exactly 6:38. Trina stepped out first, wearing a beige coat and heels that tapped against the pavement with the precision of a well-rehearsed stage cue. She opened the door for me with a smile that was just right, not too much, not too little. I gave a small nod, got in, and settled into the back seat, feeling an odd chill run along my spine. Daniel made small talk on the way, asked about my health, the house. Trina chimed in here and there, mentioning a new dessert she'd learned to bake, or a friend who'd just had a baby. The conversation was tidy, polite, scrubbed clean of any warmth. Everything was in place, and yet nothing felt real. The French restaurant was in the heart of the city, glowing with golden light and the flicker of candles bouncing off high ceilings. I'd walked past it many times before, but never thought I'd be invited in. The table was draped in crisp white linen, with tall crystal glasses that caught the light like they were trying to distract from something quietly unsettling. Daniel poured me wine with a steady hand, eyes lowered just enough to look humble. "Try this, Mom. I think you'll like it," he said, in a tone that almost passed for tender. For the first time in a long while, I took a sip of red wine without feeling its bitterness. But instead of warmth, it left a small ache in my throat. We ate. The dishes were carefully plated cream of mushroom soup, beef in wine sauce, truffle mashed potatoes. Trina spoke about a community project she was involved in, then moved on to zoning policies around the lake. I listened, nodded, stayed quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I recognized the soundtrack playing underneath it all arrangement. When dessert arrived, it looked like something from a glossy magazine chocolate mousse with chantilly cream, like a soft winter cloud resting on fine porcelain. Just as I dipped my spoon into the smooth cream, Daniel gave a small cough, then nodded to Trina. She opened her handbag and pulled out a thin folder, placing it on the table with a movement as light as air. Her voice, barely above a whisper, carried across the white linen. "So, Mom, we have a small suggestion." I didn't blink. Daniel picked it up from there, his fingers brushing the folder's edge. "It's about the lakeside property," he said. "It's still under your name, but if you'd transfer it to me, it would just make things simpler, for paperwork. You'd still live there, of course. Nothing would change." Trina added her part, like an actress in the role of a caring daughter-in-law. "There are a lot of new zoning regulations, Mom. Doing this early would help you avoid any complications later." "It's just to formalize things." I put down my spoon. My fingers touched the wine glass again, but I didn't lift it. The restaurant was warm, filled with soft music and candlelight, but I felt cold. Not because of what they asked, but because of how they asked it. Everything was too smooth, too considerate, too choreographed, designed to make me feel small enough to say yes. I smiled, gently, like someone listening to an old story that never quite stops being sad. "Thank you both. Dessert's lovely," I said. Then I paused, looked straight into Daniel's eyes and added, "But I'm not nearly drunk enough to sign anything tonight." No one spoke. Somewhere near the bar, jazz music hummed softly, mixing with the faint clatter of cutlery from another table. Trina was still smiling, but the corner of her mouth stiffened for just a fraction of a second. Daniel didn't respond. His face drew inward, caught between offense and calculation. As we stepped out into the night, Daniel reached to place my coat on my shoulders. Polite, gentle. He said, "You go on ahead, Mom. We'll stay and take care of the check." I nodded. The wind outside curled around the awnings and slipped beneath my collar. I pulled my scarf tighter, looked up at the sky. Nothing there but cold stars, bright and distant. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was just quiet. Because silence is the softest, deepest way to say no to people who no longer stand close enough to understand it. That morning, the wind arrived earlier than usual. I could hear the dry oak branches brushing softly against the roof, like a whisper from the past that hadn't quite settled. I climbed up to the attic, a room I rarely entered since Richard passed. It still carried the scent of old wood, worn leather, and the quiet dust of time clinging to things a widow can never quite put away. I wasn't searching for anything in particular. Some days, the heart simply tugs us toward what remains, not to find something, but to remember that we are still standing in the middle of a story that hasn't quite ended. I opened the small drawers where Richard used to keep what he called his someday things, a notebook tracking planting seasons, a pocket watch that had long stopped ticking, a rusted hammer, and then a dark leather box, its lock dulled with age, as brittle as the breath of autumn trailing out of reach. I opened it with the small key I always wore beside the cross, a key Richard once called number 13 because he believed in keeping one extra for everything. Inside were a few handwritten letters, a yellowing birthday card, and a small Sony cassette recorder, the old kind. I remembered it. Richard had used it to record ideas for his scholarship project for underprivileged students. I hadn't heard it in years. I pressed play, expecting no more than static, just the hissing remnants of forgotten time. But then, his voice came through, not the young, eager voice from the early days. It was the voice of the man I had lived beside for decades, steady, weathered, with a rasp at the end of each sentence like something always left unsaid. Richard's voice, clear as if I could turn around and find him sitting at his desk again, silver hair bent low over a blank page. "If you're listening to this, then I'm probably gone." I froze. My hands rested still on my knees, my heart catching mid-beat. The tape hissed softly. Then his voice returned, slower this time, thick with thought. "I've thought a long time about recording this, not because I doubt you, but because I trust you. I know, one day, you'll be caught between two hard choices, whether to hold on to what's yours or let it go in the name of obligation." I couldn't breathe. His words slipped through the years and reached into my chest, settling deep into my bones. "If you find yourself hesitating, then listen to me. Keep what I left you, not because it's property, but because it's the part of me I could never say aloud. It's the repayment of a man who was quiet, clumsy with affection, but never stopped believing in his wife." He paused. I heard him breathe in. Then the click of a fountain pen cap, the soft scratch of ink across paper, a sound so familiar it blurred my eyes with tears I didn't know I was holding. I didn't leave anything to Daniel, not because I don't love him, but because he's not ready. He used to be good, remember? But he lets the wrong kind of light blind him. I saw him sell his pride once for a single failure. You know this. You also know I took early retirement to pay his debt, without telling you because I didn't want you to worry. That's what fathers do. We sacrifice without measure. There was a long pause. Then he spoke again, quieter now, and with a weariness edged in resolve. "But you are different. You're strong enough to be the gatekeeper. Not just of money, but of memory, of this home's soul. If Daniel is ready one day, he'll come back on his own feet. But if he's not, don't let anyone make you loosen your grip." The tape stopped. That final sound echoed like a soft closing prayer. I sat there, trembling not from cold, not from grief, but from something I could not name. I felt seen. Richard was never a man for grand declarations. He didn't write me poems. He didn't buy extravagant gifts. But he remembered the things I never had to repeat. And now, after everything, what he left me wasn't just a financial fund, it was a belief. A silent note without a signature, strong enough to steady me through any storm. I removed the tape, placed it in a small box, locked it, and brought it downstairs. I set it beside our wedding photo, the one where we stood beneath a canopy of white blossoms, hands entwined, smiling at something we didn't yet fully understand. And today, after a lifetime lived, I finally do. To trust someone, even in your final moments, is the most complete form of love. I don't feel alone anymore. Because when someone has trusted you like that, even once, you can stand against the whole world. And if one day Daniel comes back, not with remorse, but with calculation, I won't lower my eyes or bend to his terms. Not out of resentment, not to win, but because I now know this. Some things are not meant to be divided, they are meant to be protected. Richard didn't leave me money. He gave me his final trust as sacred and quiet as a vow, and I, who once stood beside him silently for a lifetime, will keep standing now, quietly, but never uncertain. I've never been good with numbers, legal terms, formal clauses. They were never part of my world. My life revolved around meals on the table, children with brushed hair, a home kept orderly, more out of habit than obligation. Money matters were always Richard's domain. But after he was gone, one truth became painfully clear. If I didn't step forward to protect the legacy he left behind, no one else would do it for me. I never told Daniel about the money, or the letter, or the private fund. From the very beginning, I knew this son of mine, the same child I once held against my chest on feverish nights, whose multiplication tables I had practiced with until my eyes blurred, was no longer that boy. He had become a man who knew how to drape ambition in gentle words, and that was precisely why I could not let him know. Not out of resentment, but because I had finally learned to live with truth, even when it hurt. I sought out Lydia Crane, a retired attorney who had worked with Richard back when he laid the foundation for his community scholarship in 1982. She lived in a cedarwood house by the forest, where the surface of a small lake mirrored the autumn sky with the same unbroken clarity you sometimes see in a child's eyes. Lydia didn't ask many questions. She simply welcomed me in with a quiet nod and a pot of ginger tea. A stack of folders was already on the table, as if she had known I would come. "I need a legal structure to protect this," I said, sliding the envelope across the table, the one holding the certificate of the $19 million fund. No personal beneficiaries, no transfers, no loopholes, and above all, nothing that Daniel can access. Lydia looked up at me. Her gray eyes revealed little, but somewhere behind them, something softened, a kind of quiet understanding that passes between women who have lived long enough to stop pretending. "You want it protected, absolutely." "Absolutely," I said. "Then we'll set up an irrevocable trust. You'll name it as you wish, define the terms, set a purpose, and prohibit all forms of personal inheritance." I nodded. No hesitation. "Call it the Herald Fund," I said, my voice catching slightly. Not because Herald was my husband, but because he is the reason I still have the strength to sit here today. Within 3 weeks it was done. The Herald Fund was officially established, its terms precise and unbreakable. Not a single dollar could be used for personal gain. Not even the founder me could withdraw funds except to fulfill the mission. And what was that mission? To support older women after loss, women abandoned by their children, widows who live quietly at the margins of other people's lives, women who once gave away their best years and turned around to find nothing left but deep lines and a pew in the back row of the church. I had been one of them. Maybe I still am, but I am no longer alone. I chose to build the fund not as a wall to shut people out, but as a fence to keep sacred things from being trampled by greed. I hired an independent board, 3 older women, all with backgrounds in social work and education. They understood the invisible loneliness that follows many of us after 60 SNRS. They didn't need money. What they needed was a reason to keep being useful. We opened a small office tucked beside the city library, hung a wooden sign etched with the words, "The Herald Fund, it's never too late to begin again." No ceremonies, no ribbon cuttings, just quiet intention, like a promise that anyone who had once been forgotten now had a place to come home to. I kept everything to myself. Daniel didn't know, neither did Trina. They were still busy drafting plans for the redevelopment of the lakeside property, still thinking I was just a soft old mother growing weaker by the day. They had no idea I had moved the entire fortune far beyond their reach permanently. Some nights, I still sit at my desk in the hush of the house, the kind of hush that feels like breath held between what was and what remains. I hold the trust documents in my hands and let my eyes fall again on that word, irrevocable. Each time I read it, something in me settles and warms, not because of the wealth it represents, but because this time, this choice was mine, not made for anyone else. not in service of duty or habit, but as a quiet act of protection for myself and for the women who have known what it feels like to give everything and be left with silence. I think of Richard and the way his voice sounded on that old cassette, calm and steady, as if he were still somewhere just out of sight. I think of the way he told me, "You are the keeper of this family's soul." And I know now, you cannot keep any soul your own or another's if you allow someone else to decide what you're worth. I am not at war with Daniel. I am not punishing him. But I can no longer pretend not to see what he has become, a man who barters in affection, who asks not out of love, but out of strategy. I know he will return, not as a son, but as a man making claims, the disinherited come to knock once more. But this time, there is no door left to open. The Herald Fund is no longer just a legal structure. It is a quiet fortress of belief, built not of anger, but of trust. A final message from the man who once stood beside me in everything and now stands behind me still. If you must stand alone to protect what is right, then stand. And know that I am with you. And I did. Not with bitterness, but with love. The kind that does not fade. The kind that outlasts everything. The kind that stays. I don't remember exactly why I opened the old photo box that day. Maybe it was the weather, those late autumn days that pull the heart gently toward memory. Or maybe it was just one of those ordinary mornings that suddenly feels too full, when unspoken questions start to echo inside you like rain tapping on the rooftop, unnoticed by anyone else. The silver blue tin box was tucked deep beneath the stairs, in the drawer where I kept almost every real fragment of my life. Inside were photographs film printed, paper now yellowed at the edges, curled softly with time. Each one held a chapter. Workshops I had led for girls by the lake, summer programs, storytelling circles, evenings by the fire and dawns over camp stoves. I turned to one taken in 1997. That was the first summer I organized the Right Tell Stitch camp for girls between 12 and 16. Looking at that photo, I saw myself, hair tied in a high bun, wearing a white t-shirt that read, "Tell Your Story." Around me were 20 girls sitting in a circle, embroidery hoops in their laps, laughing with the kind of light that only children have. And then, among those young faces, I saw Trina. She was sitting right beside me, holding a piece of blue cloth in both hands, her smile a little awkward, her eyes unusually bright. That face I had seen it 100 times since, at family dinners, in polite conversations, across the table at that restaurant where she slid the legal folder toward me. But in this photo, she was still just a child, a girl who had once sat by my side, learning to pull thread through fabric, stitch by stitch. I stared at that photograph for a long time, as if someone had rewound the entire reel of my life, and I couldn't quite tell anymore whether I had been the main character or just someone passing through. Trina had once been my student. I hadn't remembered right away. The girls had come in dozens, each carrying her own story. One lived with her grandmother, another was navigating her parents' divorce, another didn't know how to write a thank you note, and I taught each one, not for praise or purpose, but because I believed everyone deserved to be heard. I had once held Trina's hand. I had taught her how to fold a proper card, to align each stitch carefully, and to write a note of gratitude for the small notebook someone had given her as a gift. I had believed that child would grow up remembering kindness. And yet, 25 years later, that same girl had returned not to say thank you, but to try to sign her name onto the land I had spent a lifetime protecting as a measure of my own worth. That coincidence, or what some might call karma, made me sit very still for a long time. I wasn't sad, but something inside me quietly broke. I had sensed it coming. It wasn't just a mother's intuition. It was the way Daniel no longer wore that sheepish smile of a son who knew he'd crossed a line. His eyes had changed, cool, glassy, calculated. And when a son stops looking at you with guilt and begins looking at you like a problem to solve, you learn not to wait for kindness. What I didn't expect was that he would come after me not with another tense dinner or manipulative silence, but with the full weight of the law, official, public, and deliberate. The court summons arrived on a winter morning, a thick envelope embossed with the city seal. My eyes paused at the bolded line, Concerning estate dispute. The petitioner, Daniel Finch. My only child. Attached was the name of a legal firm I'd never heard before, but their phrasing sent a chill through me. They accused me of intentionally concealing assets that were, in their words, the rightful inheritance of a biological heir. They demanded the annulment of Herald's will, the freezing of all connected assets, and the immediate transfer of the lakeside property into Daniel's name to ensure equitable distribution. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. My son, the boy I once taught to hold a spoon, was now petitioning a judge to legally process his mother. I didn't call him. I didn't scream. I called Mr. Kenward, Herald's longtime friend and retired attorney. He was the one who had helped me structure the Herald Foundation only weeks after the funeral. I kept it brief. He's arrived, through a lawsuit. Kenward didn't sound surprised. Then we'll respond, he said simply, in kind. We showed up to court on schedule. I wore the gray wool coat Herald had bought for our 40th anniversary. In my arms, an old leather case containing everything: the foundation documents, bank confirmations, our nonprofit's charter, tax certification, internal memos on the foundation's first initiative offering computer literacy classes for widows over 60. Inside the courtroom, Daniel sat to the left, flanked by two young lawyers, clean-shaven, crisp suits, eyes that didn't blink. He never looked at me. Maybe out of shame. Maybe because he no longer saw me as his mother. Presiding was Judge Connolly, a woman in her 60s, white hair tied back, glasses with amber frames. When she called on the plaintiff, one of Daniel's lawyers stood and launched into a polished narrative that their client had been unfairly denied a fair portion of the estate, that I, Margaret Finch, had intentionally hidden a sum of $19 million left by Herald, that this was a clear act of disinheriting the sole direct heir, and that the lakeside property had been reappraised as strategically valuable within local development plans. I said nothing. Kenward didn't interrupt. He waited like an old man who'd learned storms never last forever. When it was our turn, he calmly opened the case and presented the documents. He spoke slowly, clearly, so no one missed a word. The assets left by Mr. Herald Finch to Mrs. Margaret Finch were entirely legal, executed outside of the will, initially structured as a private trust and later transitioned into a certified nonprofit foundation well before any complaint was filed by any party. He paused only to place each document into evidence. Every dollar has been transferred into the Herald Foundation account with a defined charitable purpose. No individual is benefiting. Mrs. Finch is not an owner, she is a ceremonial guardian, and under trust law, no legal procedure may override, revoke, or redistribute assets once placed under community protection. The room fell silent. I didn't look at Daniel, not because I was afraid of him, but because I was afraid I'd cry, not from fear, but from a grief that had gone far too deep. Judge Connolly took the documents and read them carefully, page by page. She said nothing for nearly 10 minutes. Then, without flourish, she looked up and delivered her ruling. Documents are valid. Transactions are lawful. No evidence of fraud. No grounds for appeal. Motion denied. Her gavel struck wood like a door closing. Daniel lowered his head. Trina, sitting 2 rows back, stood up quickly and walked out ahead of him. She didn't glance in my direction. I didn't follow. I sat for a while longer, hands trembling not from fear, but from a strange, quiet relief. The next day, the local newspaper ran a brief piece in the community legal section. Son of late philanthropist Herald Finch loses lawsuit against Mother Charity Fund ruled fully protected. The story spread quickly. People in town whispered. But more surprising were the comments online posted by women who had taken my writing classes years ago. Some remembered Trina. I can't believe she used to be in Miss Margaret's summer poetry workshop in 1997. She was so shy. Margaret taught her how to write her first poem. And now she stood behind her husband, suing the woman who once held her hand and walked her into the world. People began asking questions. Had Trina forgotten who she was? She didn't answer. She closed her accounts, quietly stepped down from the PR committee she had been bragging about on Facebook the week before. Her career didn't collapse, but it cracked. As for Daniel, I heard he moved to a bigger city, looking for work in advertising again. We haven't spoken since. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was simpler. I had kept my promise to Herald. I had defended our name, protected the land, protected myself. And for the first time in years, as I sat by the window, watching the fog roll across the lake, I no longer felt like someone left behind. I was the one who chose to stay. I hadn't expected anything after the hearing. No headlines, no reactions. I only wanted to return to the quiet house by the lake, make a pot of chicken soup with white radish, brew some ginger tea, and let the day pass the way it always had. But this town has never been a place where storms die quickly, especially not when the one who once received kindness is the one who turns away. 2 days later, Loretta called. Her voice was still strong, despite her being nearly 80. We used to teach a class together, telling our own stories for teenage girls at the community center back in the summer of 1997. I still have the class photo pressed inside a worn-out album. Loretta didn't waste time. I know that girl, that Trina. Back then her name was Katrina, 13 years old. Wore her hair in pigtails, glasses too big for her face. She hid behind everyone on the first day of class. She once cried in your arms after some other girls teased her for not knowing how to cut embroidery thread. I held my breath. "Do you remember?" Loretta went on. "You paid her tuition that summer. You walked her home the night of the thunderstorm. You gave her a children's storybook and wrote on the back cover, 'With trust from Miss Margaret.' That little girl was Trina." I sat beside the old landline phone, listening to the wind hiss through the gaps in the heater vents. Trina. That child, now a grown woman, standing on stages with bright, polished speeches about happiness and fulfillment, yet trying to erase both land and memory from the very person who once carried her through a storm. Loretta hadn't called just to reminisce. She was never one for nostalgia without purpose. And when she posted one quiet sentence on the community Facebook page, the waters began to stir. She cried in Margaret's arms. That summer, she was given a chance by the woman she's now trying to erase. I remember, no one wanted to sit next to her except Miss Margaret. The comments poured in like the first rain after a long drought. People who had stayed silent now spoke. Some remembered Trina from children's storytelling workshops. Others said they still kept thank you notes she had written in purple ink, crooked but sincere. A younger woman recalled being in high school with Trina, hearing her once speak about an old teacher who helped me stand back up. Now, everything Trina had tried to remove from her carefully crafted biography came rushing back as testimony, not in her favor. Her posts about wellness and kindness no longer held weight. And people started asking the question no PR training could answer. If you were once raised by compassion, how did you forget it so easily? Within a week, the wellness travel company Trina had partnered with terminated their contract. Her personal website shut down its comments section. Old blog entries disappeared. I heard from the baker's wife her daughter had signed up for a retreat led by Trina this spring that the entire group canceled after reading the news. I didn't say anything. I didn't comment. I didn't nod in quiet triumph. Because I know this. The feeling of being hurt and then finally believed isn't something to celebrate. It's something to remember, quietly. Trina left town on a morning no one noticed. No farewells, no apologies. A former co-worker at the post office told me she had come to collect her mail, filled out the forwarding address, and left the recipient on behalf section blank. Her silver-gray car pulled away from the main road, past the bare chestnut trees, and no one saw her again after that. Later that week, I stood before the photo from that summer of '97, searching for her small, unsure face among the girls we had once gathered into a circle of safety. I wasn't angry. I didn't blame her. But I felt an ache in my chest because sometimes people are raised by kindness and still choose to leave it behind when ambition shines brighter. What happened didn't make me feel lighter, but it made me steadier. And because now I knew what I was protecting wasn't just assets, I was protecting memory. And memory, though some may forget, still lives in those who remember. That morning, the air was unusually gentle. The breeze off the lake carried the scent of wild mint, brushing over the fresh blades of grass still kissed with unshaken dew. I wore a pale pink linen dress and wrapped myself in the soft green shawl Richard had once given me for my 50th birthday. In my hand was a folded copy of my speech, not to read word for word, but to remind myself that I had something worth saying, not to anyone in particular, but to myself, and to whoever had come to listen. The launch of the Herald Foundation wasn't loud. I didn't want banners or a booming sound system. I wanted something quiet, like the man who built the foundation of my life. Steady, silent, unconcerned with being seen. A few older women who had once taken my summer sewing class showed up carrying homemade scones. Some boys from last season's reading camp ran across the grass with bouquets of wild daisies, and Loretta, faithful as ever, sat in the front row wearing the same pair of wool gloves she'd knitted the winter before. We didn't have a stage, just a patch of grass cleared beside the house, a few worn wooden chairs turned toward the water. The lake shimmered with midday sun, and in its reflection, I saw something I hadn't in years: myself. Not a shadow in someone else's story, but a person with her own. I stood up. My voice didn't need to rise, it only needed to carry. I didn't keep a single cent for myself. I kept it as a cushion for those who've been pushed aside, dismissed as outdated, or quietly forgotten, in their own homes, in their own families. I didn't need to say much about Harold. His name was enough. In this town, people remembered. He didn't leave behind grand speeches, but he left me, and his trust. I told them what the foundation would offer: skill classes for middle-aged women, recovery retreats for the abandoned elderly, storytelling workshops to help seniors be seen not as burdens, but as living, breathing libraries of our collective memory. Afterward, someone leaned in and whispered, "Did Daniel come, ma'am?" I smiled a small, steady smile that covered the sting still tucked in my ribs, though it no longer burned. "He'll understand one day," I said. But I'm not waiting anymore. Because a lifetime of motherhood had already taught me how to wait. Wait for a call, for a thank you, for the softness that once existed in the boy who used to fall asleep on my chest. But today, I understood something new. Not everything that matters has to be waited for. Some doors, when they close quietly, are meant to open elsewhere, not for someone else to enter, but for me to finally step through. When the ceremony ended, people stayed to share tea and warm bread, laughing over old stories. A young girl tugged at my sleeve and asked if it was true I once taught sewing. Her mother had told her that Miss Margaret stitched trust back into people with needle and thread. I knelt to smooth her messy hair and thought to myself, maybe you don't need to be in someone's family photo to be remembered. That evening, I returned to the small room beside the kitchen, the one where my writing desk had stood since the early days of marriage. The light filtered in sideways through the maple branches, casting a trembling shadow across the wall. I pulled out my old brown leather journal and turned to the first blank page in months. Slowly, carefully, I wrote, "I was never erased from this story. I'm the one rewriting the ending. Not out of vengeance, not out of anger, but out of choice." I didn't need applause. I only needed to know that when I looked back, I hadn't stayed silent. I hadn't let anyone decide for me what was worth keeping. When a lake lies still, people mistake it for being shallow, but I know better. Beneath that glassy surface are roots and silt and layers of water shaped by time and memory. I wasn't forgotten. I simply chose a different way to be remembered.